All right, today, time for another Bearded Wonder Explains. This time we are looking at the characteristics and strategies of the American War for Independence. So, the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, what do we call this conflict? And so we have the Americans on one side, we have the British on the other, and it's pretty clear that they are fighting each other because they have different goals or different aims for what they want. And so we've kind of talked before about the fact that they definitely labeled things differently. So you have what the colonists call the Boston Massacre, right? And you have the British kind of highlighting the fact that it was the Boston riots. What do you call people throwing rocks at soldiers and then soldiers shooting at those people? There were two different ways to describe it. And in a lot of ways, the way that we describe it then controls how we think about it. So the question is so the narrative or the story that we tell about history is part of it, but then historiography is also about what's the title of the book. So what is the title of the book when we have the colonists kind of rising up against the British? What do we call that? We can call it an American Revolution. This would be the idea that the Americans created for themselves a new government. A revolution means to kind of overthrow the existing government and set up a new one. We can call it a war for independence, which is pretty much the same thing as saying a war of secession, right? That they wanted to leave, take their states, and start their own thing. Kind of take my ball and go home, kind of an analogy. Or we can call it the American War of Rebellion, which, again, is this idea almost of an American Revolution. But now we have to add, like, in the American Revolution, we almost kind of assume that, if we're going to call it that the Americans had the right to do what they did. Whereas if we call it an American War of Rebellion, it would be the idea that they kind of pulled one over on the other side, in this case on the British, that they got away with it, but that maybe they shouldn't have. Opinion time here real quick. I'm going to suggest that I think that it's best to call it the War for Independence. The fact that when the colonists kind of left, that they kept the states, they kept the state governments that they had before all of this stuff kind of happened. They kept a lot of the rules that were in place in the charters and other things like that. They didn't really change their government totally. They changed the emphasis of the government, but that's more of a reformation than it is a revolution. And so I'm gonna call it the American War for Independence. So we have the British and the Americans, and today we just kind of want to set out for you what this conflict was, and what the characteristics were. Normally starting at Lexington and Concord and going through the Treaty of Paris, so 1775 until 1783. So the objectives of this conflict are pretty simple. The colonies really wanted to get Britain to recognize their right to self-rule, or at least that's what it started as. Eventually, they changed that with the Declaration of Independence. So they didn't just want their legislatures to be the ones that taxed them, but they kind of wanted Britain to butt out. So it changed from 1776 on with the Declaration of Independence. But that's basically their goal. As far as the British are concerned, their basic objective or their goal was basically to stop the rebellion, or to crush the rebel scum, in this case. So we might adopt a basic Star Wars kind of an analogy here, and get ready, because the next 30 minutes of history are going to be deep in the analogies of Star Wars. So I'm sorry if you're not a fan. I'm what you would consider beyond a fan. But anyway, so that's the objective, right? The rebels want to leave, and the Empire wants to force them to stay. So as far as basically the advantages that each side has, one of them for the colonists is militia-style fighting. In other words, the people who are fighting against the British blend in with everybody else. It's hard to know who's fighting against you when basically the colonists are just grabbing the gun that they have in the corner of the cabin, going out into the field for the afternoon, shooting at soldiers, and then going back to their house. It's really hard to tell a colonial militia fighter from just an average farmer. They literally, to the soldiers, look about the same. The second one is that they had powerful allies, particularly the French were maybe not so much friendly to the colonists as they were antagonistic towards the British. And so this was a huge advantage for the colonists. They had friends that were willing to help them. Finally, they had the advantage of really, they were fighting for an idea, right? Fighting for this idea of self-rule, this idea of freedom. And the question is, how do you fight against an idea? You can't just shoot an idea with a gun. And the reality is that when you try to fight against an idea, a lot of times you create a bigger problem than you did in the first place. If the idea is freedom and your response is to send soldiers, it gives more people the idea that they need to join in the cause. You almost make yourself into the bad guy. And so this is a major advantage. I think that you can't underestimate how much of an advantage this is for the colonists. Just as an aside to this, or if we're looking at it like a practical application point here, you think about the American war in Afghanistan, and a lot of these problems are the problems that America has had for the last almost 20 years that we've been in Afghanistan. It's hard to tell the Afghan Taliban fighter from just an average farmer in that country. They look the same to us, and you don't just want to bomb houses until everybody's dead, because you're going to kill a lot of innocent people that way. Maybe not so much the powerful allies, but the fighting the idea. When we go over there and we fight for our idea of freedom, that gives them ammunition. They point to their neighbors and they say, you see these Americans, they're trying to force us to live like them, and they're trying to run our lives and whatever. And so it actually ends up in some cases being counterproductive, right? You create more enemies out of trying to fight for what you're there for. As far as the empire, as far as the British empire is concerned, the first huge advantage that they have is having a big professional army. And so that's a major advantage. They're professionally trained. They go out, they practice shooting and other things like that. Another one is that there were a lot of people who decided in the colonies to support the British, whether it's because they felt like the government was legitimate or because they thought that the colonists were going to lose. It was a very real thing to a lot of those people to kind of decide, you know what, I'm going to help the British here because I want to make sure that when this is all over, I still have a house and a farm and all of the things that I want. And some of them legitimately thought, you know what, we need to keep protesting, but fighting and rebellion and war is not the way to go. So British and the colonists, think about them as kind of the empire and the colonies, and that kind of defines their goals. The colonies want to be left alone, and the empire wants to force them to stay. And as far as the colonial advantages are concerned, the militia-style fighting is a big advantage in some ways, but they're not professional fighters, and so it has its drawbacks. It's hard when the colonists all disappear from the battlefield to find them and beat them, At the same point, it's hard for them to show up on a battlefield and win when you're fighting against people who are trained to do that. The colonists did have powerful allies. The French definitely wanted to stick it to the British, and that meant helping the colonists. Um, and you had this war of ideas that's also going on in the colonies on both sides. You had the people who argued that they needed to stay loyal to the king, that was their responsibility to their government, and you had other people saying, no, we have freedom and rights, and we should be allowed to stand up for those ideas. And so that's kind of the advantages of both sides, which kind of defines the disadvantages as well. So as we're talking about this over the next couple of days, want you to just keep that in the back of your mind as far as how the fighting actually goes. That's it for today. Hope you have a good day.